G'day mate, 40 here, and I'm talking to my mother. Mumsy, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you, Luke?
I'm well. So, I was just thinking about a book that you had in your room, I remember growing up, and I never read the book, but the title always stuck with me, and it was just a theme that really resonated with me, and the title of the book was A Place for You by Paul Tournier, a Christian psychologist in Scandinavia or Switzerland, I believe. And it's this notion that even when life doesn't go our way, we may lose our temporal hold, we may lose our temporal community, we may move around the world, we may have all sorts of unexpected picking ups and setting downs in a new place, that God still has a place for us. Do you remember anything from that book or the ideas that were in it?
Paul Tournier was Swiss, and he was quite influential back then. I haven't recently read it, but he also wrote a book called Guilt and Grace, which was about the gospel that your dad was teaching, acceptance in Christ, and what it meant really for the psychology of the believer. And they were very profound. They're still wonderful books to read. Yes, I do remember them. They were influential. I did a bit of writing. I think I wrote something which I call Guilt and Grace based on here. Yeah, he was a big influence. I'm glad he helped you even by the title.
Yeah, just the title's always been a comfort to me because often I felt kind of dislocated, and often I felt like, I wasn't really sure where was home. Was it Australia? Was it in Seventh-Day Adventism? Was it in California? Was it in a certain line of work? Was it with a certain community? And in that feeling of dislocation, I mean, there's nothing more comforting to me than the idea of that there's a place for me. And,
Yes, I can understand that a lot happened to you when you were young.
and how about you? You've gone through a lot of pickings up and settling back down and then moving again. How have you dealt with that? Usually people get quite discombobulated when they have to move.
Oh, I'm fine about it. Um, I mean, we all went through a lot, but you have to compare what
G'day.
happens to you with what happens to other people, and people go through pain and suffering and dislocation all the time. And when I hear other people's stories, I think that my story wasn't too bad. And I watched the series The Crown, the story about the royal family, recently, and the Queen, I mean, look what she's been through. That was the impression I got. And I thought, well, what I went through wasn't really that bad. And I'm fine about Glacier View now. And really, we were fine about it at the time. We understood the difficulty that the church had in changing course. They haven't been able to do it to date. So, you know, yeah,
Right.
after a while you settle down.
Yeah. When do you think you what were your stages of grief, so to speak, with regard to Glacier View? Like, when did you get to this level of acceptance that you're at now?
Well, I really wasn't angry with the leaders so much, even though they sort of did us in. Um, I had a couple of friends, I don't really want to discuss it because they're still alive, that upset me a bit. But now when I look back, because I've just been involved in helping organize a series of interviews on something called Peter Dixon's SDA Q&A, and he has interviewed so far over 50 people about Glacier View, and it's been very informative. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't know because I've done a master in history, and looking into the past is a bit like looking into a black box. And so you only see little pinpoints of light, and there's so much that happened there that we didn't know about. Um, it's been a very good experience to have those interviews. Most of them have been 2.5 hours. Mine was nearly 5 hours. So they're significant interviews for especially for historians who want to know something about it. And just before you contacted me, for those who know his name, Fritz Guy and Larry Geraghty from La Sierra have just agreed to do an interview. So that's also very significant. Some big names have been interviewed. So that's really helped me, even though to a degree I was over it, because it was a long time ago. It was 40 years ago.
Yeah. And how did you become interested in Seventh-day Adventism in the first place?
Well, I was going along minding my business when I was about aged 18. I was living in New Zealand. I'd come from Britain. And in my family, my parents were not religious, although my mother, when I was caring for her, told me she prayed every day, which was I didn't know about. But they weren't religious. But my grandmother, my father's mother, was a Jehovah's Witness, and my sister was. And I went along probably for 3 or 4 years until I was 12, when my sister left home and upset the family. And when I was about 18, I became an Adventist. I won't go, it'll take too long to talk about how I became an Adventist. But I had studies. I'd moved away from home up to the North Island, to New Plymouth, and I was boarded. I had a job doing time and motion study, and the company said, what sort of, accommodation would I like? They arranged it, and I ended up living with an elderly Adventist who was not a typical Adventist, but I started going to church. And there was a minister there. Now, in the history of Adventism, we're not going into the details here about what the big issues were, or at least not yet. But in the 1950s, there was a very progressive General Conference president who told the scholars, go for the truth, and, basically let everything fall where it may. We'll follow the truth. And there was opposition from a man called M.L. Andreasen, and a book was written. Well, it was in response to a book called Questions on Doctrine. That's the short form of it anyway. And the book was written as a response from Adventist scholars to outsiders. I think they were Baptists, Walter Martin and Donald Barnhouse, mainly Walter Martin, who in the 50s and until he died was the Bible question man who was on the radio. And we met him later, wonderful man. But a man called Milton Andreasen, as I mentioned before, greatly objected to the changes in the church. And he had had some very high positions in the church, and basically he was sidelined. And all the opposition to your father really comes from the descendants of that man, Milton Andreasen. But I wasn't aware of any of that when I was 18. The thing about my minister was that he was a very good man. He was very highly intelligent, and he taught me a post questions on doctrine view. And one of the big issues was on whether Jesus had a sinful nature or a sinless nature, and I was taught that he had a sinless nature. So when I was 21, I went to college. Because I chose to become a Bible worker, I went straight into your father's Daniel and Revelation class, which was quite something for somebody walking in off the street. And he taught the sinless nature of Christ, and so I thought that this was, normal Adventist theology. I didn't know there was such a thing as traditional Adventism. And also, I wrote an essay in my first year. I was at college for 5 years, and your mother, of course, was alive in that year, and you were born that year. But I wrote an essay on Antiochus Epiphanes that was quite heretical, only I didn't know it. And of course, it made Dad notice me. And then the following year, I worked as his secretary. And after that, I had other jobs. I was assistant dean and other things. But your mother had cancer before you were born. And after you were born, within months, it was found that it had metastasized. And she was 5 years dying with terminal cancer. So you were sort of 2 years of your 4 years, first 4 years, were spent with other people. As you no doubt know, I'm telling other people this, not you. You were in New Zealand for a year with she'd be your Auntie Jean, and you were in Victoria for a year. But it was before the death of your mother, and about 7 months afterwards. It was over that period that you were out of the home. So anyway, do you want to ask a question? I've lost my track.
What was it? What was it that attracted you to Seventh-Day Adventism? I mean, I assume it really wasn't the theology. Right. I assume there was something about the whole package that spoke to you.
Oh, it was the theology. I was always more interested in theology than most women. I recognized some things about it from having gone to the Jehovah's Witness Church, because in my understanding, Russell, who started the Adventist Church, now I might not be quite right on this, but there was a link to Adventism way back in the 1800s. So there were some similarities about the visible second coming of Christ, and the state of the dead was the same, that when you die, you sleep until Jesus comes, rather than the general view in Christianity that you either go to hell or to heaven. So there were differences, and I guess I was lonely because I'd left home and driven myself up to the North Island. It was sort of a very independent move, and I just felt that it was the right thing to do at the time. It was really about the ideas. I believed it true.
What about the community? What about the people you met? Was there something about the community that you found fulfilling, nurturing, satisfying?
That was a good question. The church up at New Plymouth in the North Island of New Zealand was basically one or two families, and they took me in and embraced me, and I actually went back to Christchurch somewhere in there, but then I was called back again for the same job, and it was one of the women there who said you should go to college. Yes, they were a great influence on me. They took me in.
Mm-hmm. And how was your experience of Avondale College as a student?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. I know I've got friends who'd done teacher training who found it very constricting because there were, a lot of social rules that you couldn't. It was completely different to now. You couldn't walk up the street with a man. So it was very confined, quite strict. And it was the 60s. So the cultural change was there, but I feel as though I completely missed the 60s. Remember, your father was asked about the Beatles and he thought they were talking about insects.
Yeah.
So he missed the culture as well. No, but I had a great time. I was very excited to become an Adventist because I saw the possibilities. And actually, even though when we came back to from America, we were there for 23 years. This is sidetracking a little bit. But we came back in 2000 to Australia, and then gave up our membership because we could no longer attend church in America where we were, and we felt we couldn't get membership in Queensland. It's quite a conservative place, and it would have caused a stir. But I still am quite happy with what I learned at 18. I'm very comfortable with it. I tell people that Dad and I belong to the Universal Adventist Church, which is recorded up in heaven. You know, when Christians talk about the Universal Church, they mean the church in God's eyes that's made up of all believers apart from denominations. So we belong to the Universal Adventist Church. I still think pretty much that way. And it's just that, well, now we have to get on to talking about soteriological implications.
Yeah. So you published an essay called "The Soteriological Implications of the Human Nature of Christ," which was reasonably controversial, quite often talked about, and a lot of people said, well, really, it's Des who wrote it, and for whatever reason, he just had Gill put her name to it. So what's the story behind that?
So in the 1970s, there was a number of things happening. One thing was that a man called Robert Brinsmead, who was not a church member, because he's just done an interview for about 3.5 hours, very, very interesting man. He'd been very traditional, and he's sort of on my periphery. I don't know much about him. You know, I went to Avondale College. I didn't really know anybody, so I wasn't in the loop of what was happening in the church. And then I married your father in 1970, and about 4 or 5 years later, there was all this political stuff happening in the church. In the 1960s, Robert Brinsmead had taught traditional Adventism, and he taught that at the end of time, just before Jesus visibly came, there would be a supernatural blotting out of sins in the believer, because Adventism had taught that at the end of time there was a generation that were going to vindicate God, which is a pretty heretical idea when you think about it, and a perfectionist idea that which sort of came from their Wesleyan background. So anyway, Bob was very much a traditional Adventist, and he was what Dad called a gadfly on the side of the denomination. So he caused a lot of division in Australia. As you know, Australians are fighters, debaters. In 1970, Bob completely switched side and started teaching the Lutheran doctrine of righteousness by faith, which is against perfectionism in the believer in this life. And the people who had supported him, like the Standish brothers, back in the 60s, were very disturbed that he suddenly did this switch. And the reason that he switched was that in 1970, the Pope was coming to visit Australia, and Bob decided to debate a Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest talked to him before the debate and talked to him about what Luther's Reformation was all about. Now, in Bob's memory, he's about 86 now, he independently changed his mind, but your father had been saying to him, go back and read Luther and the Reformers for years before that. So whatever that was, he changed. So while your father in the 60s was considered a hero for saving the denomination in Australia from Brinsmead, and it was his job to deal with heretics. He was head of the religion department at Avondale College, and part of his job was to deal with heresy. So he was a friend. He and Bob were friends. Your dad could get on with people of all types of views. He wasn't political. But that was used against him later, that he was colluding with Bob. But anyway, back to soteriological implications. I mean, I was naive because I didn't know about traditional Adventism. And in about 1975, at the main church paper in America, the editors, Kenneth Wood and Herb Douglas, started teaching the old views, including the sinful nature of Christ. And essentially they were saying Jesus had a sinful nature. He was just like us, so we can keep the law perfectly as he did, and it leads on to perfectionism. And this idea in the last days that there'll be a generation of Adventists who perfectly keep the law and therefore vindicate God. Now, I read about this. It's taken me all this time to really work it out because in the interim, I thought I wrote it later in 1977, but I actually wrote it in 1975, fairly early on in all this upheaval over righteousness by faith. I read a book called Perfection, the Impossible Possibility, and Herbert Douglas was the editor, and there were 4 basic views in there, 2 by perfectionists or traditionalists. One was Herb Douglas and one was Mervyn Maxwell, and the other 2 spoke about perfection being impossible in this life, and that was Heppenstall, Edward Heppenstall, who was a friend of Dad's, and who was the other one? Oh, Hans Larendel at Andrews University, which is the top Adventist university in the church. So I read that book and I got a real shock. I'd never heard of this sinful nature of Christ, and so it's never happened to me before or since, but I stayed up 3 nights writing this little booklet, which was simply Bible texts from both views and Ellen White's statements. I went through her 3-volume index, and Dad liked it. He read it and he egged me on. He wrote a question and answer section at the back and showed it to the teachers at Avondale College, and they liked it, so they duplicated it, which is what you did at the time. There wasn't big ability to publish, and it got out into the village to the concerned brethren. So I sort of forgot about it. I had to teach a lesson by Herbert Douglas, and it was one in 1975 in the 3rd quarter. So I figured that I wrote it in about May 1975. And what validates that is that the Standish brothers on the other side, they've written histories of what happened on their side, and they said I wrote it the year before. They published a booklet called Conflicting Concepts. So there's a direct link between my writing soteriological implications. All that means is soteriological has to do with salvation. And somebody published my little booklet in England and called it The Human Nature of Christ and Salvation, which was a much more sensible title. But I like the word.
Yeah.
Anyway, Conflicting Concepts was basically attacking Dad about views on righteousness by faith. And then that booklet was sent to Palmdale in 1976. Now, Palmdale was a conference on righteousness by faith. It was probably coincidental, my writing the book, the writing of Conflicting Concepts, and it being sent to the head of the church, Robert Pearson, Kenneth Wood, and a vice president and friend of ours called Duncan Eva. And there was a lot of correspondence between Pearson, a man called Willis Hackett, and the staff at the review, back and forth to the concerned brethren. And I think it was in 1976 that Herbert Douglas, who was behind this sinful nature of Christ idea and writing about it, and wrote about it until he died. He talked about the Ford Brinsmead mateship. So, and also the ideas in the Standish book ended up in a letter from Pastor Pearson. Now, this is years later in 1980 at Glacier View. There was a letter read to the whole assembly on the Thursday night of Glacier View. It was a very prejudicial letter mentioning your father as not believing the new birth and sanctification and the Holy Spirit in the nature of Christ. And, you know, it came, sort of was borrowed. A friend who's a historian, who's an expert in this area, agrees with me that there was a link between the ideas in conflicting concepts and possibly another little booklet that was put out by an Australian evangelist about the same time called Dr. Ford's Dangerous Doctrines. George Burnside, who was a very popular evangelist and very interesting speaker. A lot of it was conspiratorial against the Catholics, but he was Dad's arch enemy, really from the time Dad went into the ministry. He tried to get Dad out. Yeah. So that's...
Go ahead.
No, that's all right. I've
Okay.
finished that.
Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about Avondale College and the difference between Avondale and Pacific Union College. So Avondale was a far more traditional and small C conservative place in that, like, even drinking coffee was regarded as a big sin at Avondale, or listening to pop music. But at Pacific Union College, it was much more easygoing. It just seemed, to me, my impression was that people at Pacific Union College were a lot happier. People seemed to place more of a premium on happiness, and there was a much more relaxed approach to their Adventism, while Avondale College, it seemed highly schismatic, where people were all the time ready to go to war over this or that theological doctrine. What are your memories of how would you compare Avondale College in the 1970s with Pacific Union College, which we moved to in 1977?
I don't see it as a matter of Avondale College, because really, by and large, the faculty were very much behind Dad. You had the science staff, the education staff, all good friends of Dad's and all progressive thinkers. It was more outside in the village. Now, there was a climate, very traditional as far as culture and ideas about dating and the things that you mentioned. It was quite strict. And America, especially California, was considered very liberal, even though PUC was really quite conservative. But it's interesting that you would see that. Most of it was, the Concerned Brethren. I've got a list of them somewhere. I won't remember them, but George Burnside was top of the list, J.W. Kent. A number of them were evangelists, so they were retired near Avondale, some of them, but not... I don't see Avondale that way. Actually, the Avondale years in the 60s, those of us who were there, people who write to me, see it as the golden age, because everybody agreed, they loved Dad. And Eric Magnuson, well, he was the president in the 70s. And he said to me, your dad had a huge influence on the spirituality at Avondale. Students were, inspired. They got up to go to have early, Bible studies. The tone at Avondale, under Dad's influence when he was head of the religion department, was amazingly peaceable. And it was actually the same at PUC. When we got there, we'd been tainted as Brinsmeads. Now, there were a couple of people at PUC. Erwin Gain, who was an Australian, former Australian, was very traditional. He didn't want Dad there. And Maurice Venden, who was the pastor. He used to take pot shots at Dad in the sermons. And most of the time, Dad was away speaking. He had a phenomenal program at PUC and was away speaking at least 3 weekends a month. And that was after they cut his meetings down. But he said, I've got to take the wave, to use the surfing symbol. He said that this may not last. So he knew he was under a sword. But so Murray used to openly preach against him. Murray had a huge influence. He was a very spiritual man, and he talked a lot about Jesus, but he was still fairly conventional, focused on sanctification and perfectionism. And so those two people at least were very opposed to Dad. So there was that going on. But the Dad took, when he was home, which wasn't much, he would take a Sabbath school class, an adult Sabbath school class at PUC, and at least 300 people would turn up. That's where we met Greta Hartelius, our great friend. She attended, and people loved it. So you've got these tensions going on, and but both the chairman at Avondale and at PUC, Dad was no trouble on the campus. He was peaceable, but it was mainly outside. You know, it was forces outside.
Now, I like the tripartite description of Seventh-Day Adventists, as you've got traditional Adventists, who are generally opponents of our Father, who held very strongly to traditional, unique, distinctive beliefs and practices of Seventh-Day Adventism. And then you had evangelical Adventists who believed very strongly in the gospel, similar to what Dad taught. And then you had lifestyle Adventists. Now, at Avondale College, I didn't know that many lifestyle Adventists, if any, while at Pacific Union College and in California, Adventism in general seemed like probably half of the Adventists that I knew or was acquainted with were lifestyle Adventists. So that's why it seemed to me that the happiness level at Pacific Union College was substantially higher than at Avondale, and that Australian Adventism was a much more traditional and a much more schismatic expression of religion compared to California Adventism. Any thoughts?
No, I think you're absolutely right. My view is looking out from being in the colleges themselves, which were more progressive. But you know, even in America, Californian Adventism is seen as very liberal, even though a lot of the people are very conservative. And it's actually rather better than saying liberal versus, well, I'm not sure what they say versus liberal.
Traditional. Distinctive.
It's better to, I mean, Dad was very conservative, as you know. He was a great believer in Ellen White. He basically, as Bob Brinsmead said, she was his grandmother. So he lived his life by the things that she'd written, hugely influenced by Ellen White. And actually, he went off track because he was so widely read in Ellen White that he went past the chapters in Great Controversy. I might be going a little bit off piste here, but it's an actual fact. His ideas on prophecy that were different to mainstream Adventism came from Ellen White, because Dad did 2 PhDs. He did one before I was around. Your mother was there. That's before you were born. In 1958 and 1959, he went to Michigan State University and did a PhD in rhetoric. Now, his opponents say it was a PhD in speech, which is a bit of a put down, but it was actually about the rhetoric of the Apostle Paul. and he was highly regarded there. In fact, a lot of experts wanted to come in and hear him defend his orals because there was a lot of interest in the Apostle Paul. Because the Apostle Paul, now this may not be true, and I've heard it obviously, and some might question it, had a lot to do with the beginning of democracy, his ideas. It's a game changer. I'm sure people would question that, but that's sort of what I understood. So there's a lot of interest in his PhD. That was 58, 59. And then in 1970, the year that your mother died, we got married 7 months later. Your mum knew about it. She knew from the beginning of 1969. And she told the church leaders and her neighbours to keep out of it. We used to go walking in the Watergan. You'd come along and I would take care of you, babysit you in the afternoon. And she told the church leaders, this is what I want, don't interfere. So we got married, and then within a week you came home, and the next day we went to England. So, I mean, huge changes. You went through massive changes as a little child. Anyway, that doctorate in England under F.F. Bruce, who was at his time the greatest evangelical scholar in the world, who accepted Dad in because of the quality of his first PhD. He read that, so Dad didn't have to do all the previous, BD, MDiv. He went straight into a PhD program. Well, Dad's ideas came from Ellen White. They were on 2 Thessalonians 2, the man of sin, a future sort of before the second coming, a form of an antichrist figure. And Dad based his ideas on what Ellen White had said. They were very progressive. He doesn't know where she got them from. This text in 2 Thessalonians 2 about the hinderer or the restrainer and the man of sin is what they call a crux interpretum. Very difficult passage. So you have people, scholars, with all sorts of ideas, and somehow Ellen White had all of them. And at the end of his thesis, after his orals, which he passed successfully, F.F. Bruce said to him, if anybody asks you what was your unique contribution to Adventism, point to this. And he got it from Ellen White. You see, and people don't really know that. So where he differed from the church prophetically, he actually got from Ellen White. And the big issue at Glacier View was the authority of Ellen White.
Okay, but, hang on a second. Let me just ask you a question. Did Dad ever turn his first PhD thesis into a book?
No, no, he didn't. But I've got it.
Do you know why he didn't? Because he published virtually every book that he had inside of himself. Like he published a ton of books. Probably there are one or two of them that are the closest approximation to that thesis.
No.
No.
I don't think so. But it could be published if somebody was interested in it. I do have a copy here. And it's a thought. But got to remember, all the publishing came through me. I was a typesetter and a bit of a graphic designer. I've done some courses in it. So I was able to publish a lot of Dad's books after the church stopped publishing them. But that was long before my time.
Did he ever talk about publishing that first PhD thesis in book form? No.
No, but it's not a bad idea. I might look into it. Thank you.
Now, my impression of the Pacific Union College community was that it was a lot happier and less schismatic a place than Avondale. What's your memory on that score?
Well, as I say, among the education department, you've got Trevor Lloyd, and then you've got the science department. They were all with your dad. I can't really think of anybody who was opposed to him before Glacier View. And of course, at the division, the leaders, Elsie Naden, had a role in bringing a very godly man. He was the president of the division at one time, around that time, and then Elder Frame. And they were very much for Dad because he'd saved them. They trusted him. They liked his religion. They liked the students that came out of Avondale. In fact, Frame wrote to us since we came back to Australia before he died, and he said, he said the quality of students that came out under Dad, he said, was impressive. And he was very supportive. Even he'd read Dad's biography and he'd be in his 90s, and he said, I wish I could have supported you more. So it was a golden time at Avondale, even though it was very conservative. And some people that really bothered. It never bothered me. I went to college. I sort of bypassed the 60s, as I said. But I can see what you mean. And definitely in California, as the whole church knows, they're more relaxed. Yeah. But
Yeah.
we had a wonderful time at Avondale. All the controversy was sort of outside, and they didn't have trouble with Dad. So, I mean, the concerned brethren, we call them the concerned brethren. You remember Bob Parr, who was the editor of the Australasian Record. He called them Groff, get rid of Ford. And he called us fish. Ford is staying here. So nobody needs to be insulted by these things because, we were called fish and that's not very nice. But it was a joke, obviously. I've lost my track.
No, that's okay. That's okay. That's so. So we effectively, socially moved out of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church after Glacier View. So what did you miss and what did you not miss about being intensely in the middle of Seventh-Day Adventism after 1980?
Well, 1980, you remember we moved, we went back. Now, where did we? Oh, we went from PUC to Newcastle, California, and set up Good News within a month or two, Good News Unlimited. And sort of Dad went immediately from one job to another. He traveled a lot and had to write a lot and so on. But we still went to the Adventist church. We went to the Loomis Church and other churches that were around us in California. The problem with that, and I think we did it for quite a while. There were always, most people were okay about it. Generally, people didn't treat us any different. They still loved us, and we received really a tsunami of love from the church ever since. So we weren't shunned, but there were always a few people, a couple of families, wherever we were, and they would call the conference office, and that made it very difficult for the pastors. They came under fire. So in the end, we did sort of move out. We were still members at PUC until we moved in 2000 and 2001. And then Dad wrote and gave up his membership, our membership. He said, we're going to do this because we just couldn't go there anymore. It didn't seem right to keep our membership there. And then we had the problem of whether to join again in Queensland. And Dad had come back and was offered a job at a Baptist college, which didn't work out because the wrong person offered the job. But he just longed to go back into teaching.
But what did you miss and not miss about being such a close-knit part of the Seventh-day Adventist community after 1981?
A lot didn't change because most of the people, when we were in America between 1980 and 2000, a lot of the people who supported Dad were Adventists. You know, he'd done all that speaking. The church was very nice and sent him everywhere. We weren't under fire when we went to California. And so a lot of those people made up good news. So we remained in touch. We sort of moved from not a central position in the church, but Dad was quite prominent in a way. You know, he was speaking all the time. He was a big voice. But we went to the periphery of Adventism and basically worked for them unpaid. Well, we got paid by Good News, but voluntarily we tried to help them most of our lives, really. So it wasn't a lot different. So I don't know what to say about that.
Okay. So were you surprised or were you fully prepared for what happened at Glacier View and its immediate aftermath?
I'd say we were, because you'll remember...
we were surprised or we were fully prepared, which...
We were prepared.
Okay.
It goes a bit like this and that because you don't know exactly what's going on. Is my sound okay?
Yes, you sound fine.
Okay. So let me just think back what I need to tell you. So I told you these two forces, the CBs, who were plastering everywhere Dad went in America. They had friends in America, obviously. Everywhere had been littered with George Burnside's, Dr. Ford's dangerous doctrines. Or if Dad went to speak at camp, every tent had them in it. How they did it, I don't know. So there was that going on. But at the same time, Bob Brinsmead was proceeding. And in 1978, he came to America and he talked to Heppenstall, Dr. Heppenstall, who was a gospel preacher and had questions about the investigative judgment. And he also talked to Dad, and he asked them both if they would bring this subject out into the awareness of the people, and both of them weren't keen to do it. Dad said, I've got enough problems as it is. So Bob went back home at the end of 1978, and he wrote 1844 Re-Examined, and that was published in July 1979. And at the same time, your father had been given 3 months off at PUC to write a commentary on the Book of Revelation. And in that time, there was no connection, although we were accused of it, between what Bob Brinsmead was doing and what Dad was doing. Anyway, in that 3 months in the summer of 1979, I keep on fiddling with things and I don't mean to do it, but I'm just checking on my volume. Okay.
No, everything's fine.
Okay. It's all right now. I fixed it. Anyway, so Bob's going in his direction. He's now coming out against the investigative judgment. And Dad's writing on Revelation, and he went to Washington, D.C. at this time and went to the Library of Congress, handled everything on the Book of Revelation, and he looked at the mode of looking at Revelation called historicism. Adventists are historicists, and they saw everything fulfilling in the 19th century. And he realized from earlier books, there were books from the first centuries of, or manuscripts, first century AD and Luther's time, where people in different ages who used the historicist method, which is essentially looking at the Book of Revelation like a newspaper to see what's going on in your day. And he realized that Adventists had done the same thing in the 19th century. And what happens as time goes on, it's nearly 200 years since Adventists predicted the very soon coming of Jesus, and it's getting on for 200 years. So it becomes passé. But the church, because it's part of their identity, is not able to change from its original story. It's like its DNA. And so when people question it, what they do is they don't really investigate it. They just reboot, like an illustration, they reboot the computer and go back to the original SDA story, which is not, it's got historical and biblical inaccuracies, so it's a problem. Now, what was the question?
Yeah. So
I'm trying to tell you what led up to Glacier View.
yeah.
That was it. Okay, so that's it. First of all, Bob comes out with this book. Dad does his crisis commentary, which we had to self-publish because the church would, after Glacier View, would no longer publish his books, obviously, and stop publishing and selling like his Black Daniel, which was a classic. So this is 1979, and in October, he's asked to take the October 1979 forum, in which he's asked by Wayne Judd and Adrian Sikorsky. You'd remember Wayne Judd from PUC,
Yes.
who are the faculty who ran the local forum, which was sort of an independent group in Adventism who brought discussions like this to the front. And they asked, would he basically answer Bob Brinsmead? And he said, oh, this will cause trouble. And they said, oh, no, you'll be protected by Spectrum. And obviously he wasn't. Now, all sorts of ideas had been preached in Spectrum from liberal scholars, but they'd never, ever punished anybody for it until this time. But it's sort of, Dad handed himself to the CBs. At last they got him on something where the church, had to deal with him, essentially. So he took that talk, and that's the end of October, and almost instant, we went to Andrews. Dad did a talk at the main university, and I stayed on because my friend Robin Priestley was there, and I called home. Ellen was visiting Dad, that's Des's daughter, was visiting her father, and she answered the phone and said, you're going to Washington. And Dad got on the phone, and he'd been given 6 months study leave. Now, as soon as you hear that phrase, there isn't a job at the other end. That's what they do with people when they mean to fire them. So it wasn't a surprise. But Dad and I were amazed that they would take it to a global level where scholars and administrators from all around the world would come to discuss Dad's, well, he hadn't written this manuscript then, but the ideas that he had put forward. But we were pleased about it because we thought, well, they could have fired Dad at PUC and saved a lot of money, because the way it was run, the end was determined before the beginning. It wasn't, they didn't look at Dad's manuscript at all. So Dad left, he wasn't allowed to do his exams. Somebody else did his exams and his classes because he was teaching that semester. He was raced off to Washington, D.C. I stayed behind. I had to pack up the house. And I left in January, and then you stayed with Greta Hartelius to finish your school year until June, if you remember that.
Yes,
so
very clearly, yeah. It wasn't a surprise that the results of Glacier View weren't a surprise, and even that speech that Dad gave in October of 1979 that sort of cleaved the church in two. I remember a tremendous amount of excitement prior to the speech, and so that this speech would go on to rend the church in two, that can't have been a surprise either, because we were expecting that this would have a dramatic effect.
Well, back in 1978, I won't go into all the details of it, but Keith Parmenter had come in as the president, and he wasn't like Freeman or Naden. He wasn't progressive at all. He didn't want any new ideas. He'd been an evangelist. And there were 3 meetings with Dad, 1970 before we got married, and then 2 in the 1970s where Dad was called down to answer his beliefs. by the CBs in front of the division. And the third one was quite a big meeting because Elder Frame, who was very tolerant towards them, called in all the heads of departments, education, everybody. And what happened, Dad he went down by train, he had a huge suitcase of books, Adventist books, and so he answered the CBs using published works because the church had made a lot of changes. What Dad was presenting wasn't really anything new. It's just that it was a more public thing. He was probably a better orator. Everybody said that, he's a remarkable orator. So, but these things had come up right through the history of the church. So it was nothing new. Dad, anyway, I was telling you about 1978. Essentially, we got a letter from Elder Parmenter, and it was very political the way he did it. I've done the history of what was behind it. But he basically said to Dad, you won't be coming back to Australia, you'll be staying at PUC. Now, we'd been promised, it was a condition of Dad's going that we go back to Avondale. And since you like PUC, you probably wouldn't have wanted to go back. But we've got the evidence that they agreed that Dad could go back. And then in 1978, we'd only halfway been, we were only halfway in the time at PUC. So a year after we've left and a year before we were going to left, Parmenter tells him we're going to stay at PUC. And if you come back to Australia, you won't be going back to Avondale. You'll be going out into the field as an evangelist or a pastor. Now, Dad knew he wouldn't survive because the CBs would stir things up. And he knew it was a political device by Parmenter to settle things down in Australasia. And Dad felt they would isolate him, and I've said that, and he'd be fired. So after that letter, your father, who was very idealistic, a promise was a promise. He wouldn't have cared if he'd gone back, I think, as a teacher, and they'd stopped him being head of the department. But it was the breaking of a promise that was made to him by 3 people. And he said to me after that, although it was 2 years before Glacier View, he felt he had nothing to lose by going to making these things public.
Yeah.
And the thing about the forum meeting is that Dad said to me on the afternoon of it, oh, nobody will come along for this. And Dad was going to speak in the music hall at PUC, which is quite a small room. It's got cymbals and all sorts of stuff in it. It was just quite a small room. But people came and they came, and about 1,000 people turned up. So they had to change the venue. And I don't know whether you were there and remember this, but there were 1,000 people racing up the steps to get to Irwin Hall at the top. It was quite a sight. So Dad didn't expect anybody to be interested in it. And people actually came long distance from all over the place to hear that talk. So it's quite...
I remember the sense of excitement in the air. There was more excitement around that speech than any other speech that my father gave that I remember during the Pacific Union College years. That there was an electricity in the air, and I personally didn't care about theology. But I remember the social drama of it. And a question: how much social ostracism did you suffer in the Adventist world for being married to a controversial Adventist theologian?
Not much. I mean, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you leave, you get shunned. But I've never felt like that. People have always been welcoming, especially in recent years, because a lot of ministers agree with Dad. They can't say it or they'd be fired, but I know that that's true. But I was going to say to you about Dad's talk. He presented the problems with the traditional view on the investigative judgment, but then he presented his solutions because he felt that he could give a biblical presentation that would solve Adventism's problems about being biblical and being relevant to a world who thought of them as a cult generally. Most people in the evangelical world think of Adventism as a cult. And Dad had, I mean, he was, he had an amazing memory. I mean, you're pretty much the same. You've got a mind very much like your dad. Very intuitive, very smart, and he knew his stuff because he'd worked on it for years and he'd gone through, you know, anything to do with it, including Ellen White, he was encyclopedic about. But Graham Bradford who was a friend of ours, a minister in Australia, who was always a friend until he died. He said what they didn't realise was that while your father presented all the problems, he was trying to present solutions to solve the problems Adventists had with the outside world. He felt he could make a biblical case. And it certainly was different to what the church had traditionally taught.
Here, let me jump in.
Yeah.
How much was Dad able to see accurately what was going on with the machinations, the bureaucratic infighting, the power struggles, the power of his opponents? Was he naive? Was he seeing things accurately? What was he missing, if he was missing anything?
No, he wasn't naive. He knew what was going on. He was idealistic, and he was a real Christian gentleman. They made a lot of, we'll get to this later, but there are a number of accusations, including collusion with Bob Brinsmead. But in the ministry magazine at the end, Neil Wilson had to admit that Dad behaved like a Christian gentleman. I mean, he was direct, told the truth, and he was very clear because he was a logical thinker. But, you know, you sort of live, you think you know what's going to happen. You're pretty sure that it's not going to end up well. But when we first got to Glacier View, is it all right to start talking now about this?
Sure.
Yes. Neil Wilson Neil Wilson, who was the father of the current General Conference leader, he'd been a diplomat in Egypt and very skilled diplomat. He'd been down to Loma Linda the week before and talked to the scholars who were worried about the outcome. He said, don't worry, Desford is not on trial. His ideas are on trial. Well, he actually was on trial, but he was able to, he made it, when they came to Glacier View, they thought it was going to be all right. And at the end of the week, you'll remember that there was a discussion about Dad going to the new gallery in England as an evangelist. Do you remember that?
Yes, very much.
And you didn't want to go. I remember that.
Yes.
So the scholars were taken off guard at the beginning. You know, those Loma Linda scholars would have gone there and told the other scholars, don't worry, it's going to be all right. Des is not in trouble. And then at the end, it was talked on the floor about our going to England. It was suggested by an Australian, Walter Scragg, who was the European division president at the time. And a lot of them left on the Thursday night, and the discipline committee took place on the Friday. So they were taken off guard. In fact, Fred Veltman, who was Dad's boss at PUC, I've just been sent his notes on Glacier View, and he's quite critical of Dad. It was quite confronting. But what you have to add to those notes that he wrote at the end of August, he then went on holiday and went around the country and got talking to people, and he realised what the administrators had done. And he wrote to them a long letter, and just a couple of lines from it said, we've been duped, meaning the scholars have been duped. And he wrote to Dad and apologised to him, because he'd initially, after Glacier View, written to PUC administration and said it's Des's fault. And then he found out what happened. So I don't, this, I mean, the scholars, I'd say generally that the good scholars in the church knew the problems that Dad presented and didn't necessarily agree with his solutions on how to solve the problem. And that, which is fine. But they did recognize the problems, and this came out when they wrote their consensus statement. Very much went towards Dad's documents, but that's not what they fired Des over. They didn't use the consensus statement.
I really liked Fred Veltman. I remember having Sabbath lunch at his home, and I remember we were able to talk about football and the Pittsburgh Steelers linebackers, and I have very fond memories of my Sabbath lunch with the Veltman family, but very amiable. Pretty much everyone on the faculty at Pacific Union College is very amiable.
They were.
Yeah, very pleasant people to be around.
See, the thing about Fred was a very good scholar. He mainly worked on manuscripts. He's the person who looked at Ellen White's borrowings after Walter Ray attacked the church about Ellen White and plagiarism. Fred was the one who went, I think, into Desire of Ages, word by word. That was his expertise. And so he's a scholar and somewhat, he's not an evangelist. And see, Dad was like somebody from outer space. I said this somewhere else, but he was always trying to curb Dad, because Dad had a mission about the gospel. And, you know, he was a true believer, but he was an evangelist. So Dad's going around the country speaking everywhere, and Fred says, why don't you stay home? So I said to people, the Fords are, a lot of intelligent people are eccentric, and the Fords have their eccentricities, which is probably annoying to people. So Fred definitely would like to have calmed Dad down a bit.
Yeah, that's very unusual. I can't think of any other Seventh-day Adventist scholar evangelist. Normally, these are two very different categories. And so if Dad had simply stayed with his scholarship and backed off a bit with his evangelism, he probably wouldn't have run into as much trouble with the church bureaucracy.
Well, if you're trying to maintain an institution, that's one thing. But if you really want to transform the lives of the world, you know, it's a very different thing. And Dad was a true believer. He was both.
Yeah. Now, was Neil Wilson a more effective political player than our father? Than Dad?
Oh, Dad wasn't political at all.
Yeah.
No, I don't think he was naive about it, but you know, he basically came in saying, look, the church has got problems. Doug Hackelman is writing a biography of the Cottrell family, Ray Cottrell, who thought pretty much like Dad. He was a scholar and associate at the Review and Herald for years, highly regarded. He took a meeting with the same ideas against the investigative judgment. I think one at Andrews and one at Loma Linda within a week of the one that Dad took on October 27, 1979. And nobody turned a hair. In one of them, he was talking to the scholars, so it wasn't a meeting open to the public. The church was very conscious of somebody who stood out and rallied the people. I think that was the huge concern.
Yeah, how much of the opposition to Dad was just primarily a function of personality? They just really took exception to this pugnacious personality. They just personally hated him.
Well, they wanted to moderate him in a major way.
Well, people often use as excuses for why they hate someone, and so it's very easy to say their theology. but often people mask their hatred, their personal hatred, with all sorts of high-sounding excuses, such as theology or philosophical differences or political differences or whatever. But the hatred for my father, your late husband, was incredibly visceral and personal much of the time.
Yes, it was a lot of it was based on a loyalty to the church's ideas. But as an example, when Dad went out into ministry originally, so this would be in the 50s, I can't remember exactly when because I wasn't around, he joined the George Burnside team as a helper. And George Burnside used to have these workers' meetings, and he'd say, ask me a question, any question. Well, Dad raised the idea of Turkey being the king of the North, which was an old Adventist position about the time of the First World War, when they thought this was part of the end scenario. And it had become passé in America. So Dad asked this question, and later George Burnside took him apart and said, I hear you've got a big head. And basically, you need to be careful or you'll be out. And he had a personal antagonism to Dad from that time. He challenged his authority, I suppose. And he called Dad Antichrist, who lived near Avondale. So that's an example.
Yeah.
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
and
go ahead.
And your grandmother had an affair with a conference president, which was hugely humiliating to your father because he was about 9. And Burnside's brother, I met him in New Zealand, and he would have got it from George Burnside, called Dad a bastard. He wasn't. He was a legitimate son of his father. But, it wasn't very Christian, put it that way.
Yeah.
And that was the heart of it. And really the heart of the opposition was because Dad was soft on the Catholics. And Adventism, traditional Adventism was very much, we're the Protestants and we're against the Catholics. Now, they couldn't get out of this. Most other Protestant churches have sort of got over this antipathy, which came from, the history of Henry VIII and the separation from Rome that took place then when he made himself the head of the church in England. So it's old stuff that is carried on through the churches. But because the church is so tied to its old prophetic agenda and has the Catholic Church basically as Antichrist, they can't get out of it. It's part of the original story, and they take this original story of how they came to be very seriously, with good reason, because historical scholars say that the churches, that the denominations that last are the ones that stick to their original story. So you can see their problem. They've got a story that historically and biblically is not factual, because they disagree about that. But if they go away from it, it's just a major thing. And we always understood that. Dad said to them in the final meeting, where they, by the way, you'll like this, they said he was like Jim Jones.
Yeah.
In his effect on people, which was not the right thing to say.
It's not very nice.
No. But he said to them, look, I understand. He said, I won't cause you any problem. I'll go in the review, which they didn't ask him to do, and say, don't leave the church over me. He was very conciliatory. He said, look, I understand the problem that you've got.
Now, do you consider yourself a Seventh-Day Adventist today?
I'm not a member. I belong to the Universal Adventist Church up in heaven. It's recorded up in heaven. It's not the one down here.
Yeah, Dad couldn't be Jim Jones because he didn't like Kool-Aid.
Didn't like poison much either.
Didn't like poison either.
But I mean, what a thing to say.
Now, there's a guy whose name I heard a reasonable amount growing up in our home, who I've just rediscovered his work, Ronald Numbers. He wrote
Oh,
books
yeah.
about Ellen White and on creationism. Do you remember Ron Numbers?
Well, he just did an interview with Peter Dixon,
Oh,
along with Jonathan Butler, who was a very well-known Adventist historian. I think they've both left the church.
yes.
Yeah. So he found out the problems with Ellen White. As I say, the main issue, as Arthur Patrick pointed out to me, and other people have said, was the authority of Ellen White, because she had backed up this doctrine of the investigative judgment. She didn't come up with it. It's in the book, her book, The Great Controversy, but some of that was a bit of a compilation because the chapters on the sanctuary were written by Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews, but she did go along with it. See, Dad would say they'd come out of the great disappointment, the Millerite disappointment, when a date was set, October 22, 1844, for the literal second coming of Jesus. And followers, the farmers had not even planted crops, and they'd made ascension robes. And of course, Jesus didn't come. And Adventists came from that group. Ellen White was part of it, Joseph Bates, who was a sea captain. And it was such a big thing. It was so momentous in their mind that they were trying to interpret what exactly happened. And it took till about 1857, 13 years after the event, to come up with the idea of the investigative judgment. And there was a man, his name's Elian something or other, short name, who came up with the idea. He was a lay preacher, and James White, Ellen White's husband, took it up. But it was sort of another mistake. But it became the rationale, a main foundational part of Adventism, which I told you about Doug Hackelman's book on Cottrell. Cottrell believed like Dad did, and he was a major scholar. He knew Daniel in all the original languages. He was a very good and clever man. He knew all the problems that Dad did. And in doing this biography of Cottrell, because Doug sent me the first 34 chapters right up to the Glacier View. He's put it aside at the moment. But what reading that book did for me was he mentions many of the people who were either put out or left the church on this issue. It's been an ongoing issue from the beginning, and Dad was just the latest, maybe the brightest, and certainly the most eloquent, and he had a global audience. The church took it from PUC and brought in all these international scholars, and so they made it, a huge issue.
Did you have any significant theological or religious differences with Dad?
No, my issues with Dad were mainly that he was so untidy. I used to say it was like living with the jungle that keeps on growing and you've got to keep hacking it back.
Yeah.
No, we were very like-minded. The fact that I wrote that essay and I got what he said about Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted the Jews, as you know,
Yes.
which was anathema to Adventists because it sort of undermines the view of Roman Catholics being the Antichrist. Although Dad thought that you could include them because he used his apostolismatic principle. But I got what he said, and Dad, he gave me an A for the essay, which was a surprise at the time. This is 1966. Never mentioned it to me until we were about to be married, and he said if I'd written that essay, I'd have been fired. And before we died, he said that when he read that essay, he felt that someone had understood him. And that's what made him notice me. So we were really very like-minded on ideas. That was our big connection. And And also soteriological implications. That is a problem at the heart. I'm not the brightest person. If I went into a class, I wouldn't come top. But I've got an ability to look at complex issues and simplify them for ordinary people who can't do. I can't. I couldn't give you a Bible study on investigative judgment, but I can tell you the difference between what that person's saying and what that person's saying. So we were very much like-minded. I was very much for him. I gave, most of my energies to helping Dad. Together, he was so grateful when he was dying. He said it to me again and again. He was thankful for what I'd done to help him, because I was able to publish a lot of his articles and tidy them up, and same with his books.
And since he died, you've also been working on his materials too, I believe.
I sure have. I have put all his books. I had to pack up half of his library. He had over 11,000 books. I don't know what the final number was, but it went over 11,000. And because you couldn't get around his library after he died, it was full of boxes, and it had shelves. We've got plenty of time. It had shelves that were built against the wall, and like library shelves on 2 floors, and then he had a 3rd floor where he had shelves as well. And then we'd put about 14 smaller bookshelves in there, and you actually couldn't get round the library. All packed up. Get the prep professionals in, I essentially had to get rid of all of the smaller ones, and I had help to tidy it up. And I had to pack half of those books myself. So that's one thing I did. And then there were boxes and boxes of documents, about 90 boxes. And Dad's filing was rolling up a document and throwing it in the box. And I had to flatten everything, sort it all into non-des documents, stuff that he was reading. He read phenomenally like you do, 5 or 6 hours a day. Because he was constantly writing, and in later years doing radio broadcasts and TV broadcasts, so he had stuff on all sorts of things. So I separated into what he was reading and stuff actually to do with him, and then I sent all of that stuff off. I don't tell people where it's gone, because it's been done in a clandestine fashion so that nobody damages it. And then I decided that instead of sending these documents, I would scan them. So I scanned, it took me 6 months last year, nearly 18,000 documents, some of them 30 pages. And pretty much all of it had to be done manually, page by page, because of the age of the documents. And as I was leaving the house, then I had to pack the house and sell it. I've got about 8 boxes over here with most of the stuff in there has to be scanned because it's got letters and stuff. And I've still got to do that. That'll take me 4 or 5 weeks, I'd say. But I got involved in these interviews, so I haven't been able to get back to it. So it's been a lot of work.
Yeah. What was what was on Dad's mind his last few weeks of life?
I think he was very much at peace. He spoke about, I'm trying to think, it's amazing what the past does. I think he died
early March.
Early March, yeah. I moved. He died on the 11th. My voice is going to go, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we'll make this the last bit. So
okay. He died on March the 11th, and I moved the next February the 11th, so I get mixed up. And he'd had a couple of strokes. So in the early January, he had the last stroke. This was 2019. He became, there's a word for it, impulsive. He was home all but 20 days. But he became impulsive. Uncle Val was just the same. It's the hyper nature of the Fords. And so he wanted to go up to the turret, and I was against it. But you couldn't stop him. So I thought, well, I'll get up in the night and check up on him. And he must have had a stroke in the night and fallen. Now, there was 2 levels of a circular staircase, and up the top there were, from where he was sleeping, because psychologically he loved that place, that you could see the sea. And it was a place for him. You'd understand what I mean by that.
Yes.
I'll just have a drink. I've done a lot of talking the last few days. I did a 5-hour interview, and last night I had no voice at all. So we've done well to get this far.
Yes.
Anyway, he got up, and because he'd had a stroke, he just fell down the stairs, fell down the circular staircase, crawled across 2 rooms, and I was sleeping in an armchair in the lounge. I slept there for a year. I mean, not constantly, but... and I thought I heard something. I woke up, I couldn't hear anything. I thought, better go and check Dad. It was in the middle of the night. Got to the top of the stairs, and he was lying in front of me. And we think afterwards, he was never checked out, that he'd had another stroke, which led to the fall, and probably a brain bleed. And he said to me, I've had a bad fall. You're not going to be able to look after me. You're going to need help. I can't organise my mind, and I can't stand. And so it took me about an hour. He didn't want me to call an ambulance. It took me about an hour to get him seated in a chair. Then he wanted to go downstairs, and I couldn't stop him. And I said, okay, put your arm around my shoulder. And there were handrails both sides, wooden stairs. And he couldn't walk down the stairs. So I had to put my left foot under his right foot, put it down to the next step, and then do the same with the other foot, all the way down 2 flights of stairs. But I got him down. Then he was not able to go upstairs. So after that, when I talked to him, often you couldn't understand what he said. I knew what he was talking about. Sometimes and he could always understand what I said. Or if somebody walked in and talked to him about theology, he could answer them perfectly normal. But on the day-to-day thing, he was confused.
Yeah.
But I had to, in the end, he went into hospital twice, and the doctor said to me, the specialist said to me, you cannot do this. He said, nobody can do this. You need a team. And he ate, I was cooking and doing everything and looking after him, and I admitted I couldn't do it. So we put him in respite. He was only in there for 8 days. But as his abilities, this wonderful mind, he did his last sermon about 3 months before he died on assurance, and we're in somebody's home, and there are about 40 people. People came from New South Wales, quite a long way away, and they were absolutely riveted. And he spoke about Christian assurance. I think that's what he was thinking about in his last months. That's the answer to your question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, Mumsy, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, but the last thing was, when he could no longer organise his mind and he couldn't stand up, when he was in respite, he kept falling out of bed, and they had to put the bed on the floor. What was left, his character was wonderful. And the nurses said to me, after he died, they all came up to me and they said, no, this was in hospital. They said, what a wonderful man, what a beautiful man. He treats us so beautifully and so kindly. We never get this. So you can be proud of your father.
Yeah. I remember some of the the pictures and the anecdotes that you gave when he talked to the nurse. When you say, "Hi, I'm Desi. What's your name?"
Yeah. And he sat up in bed because she asked him. I said he doesn't want to stay around, and or he wants to leave the planet. And she said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to be. I won't remember it exactly. I'm going to be with Jesus, and it'll be wonderful." That wasn't it exactly. Beautiful
Yeah,
statement. And he
yeah,
was shining.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Luke. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thanks, Mumsy. Good to talk to you. Take care. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Bye bye. Okay.
Having listened and watched the videos done at Morisset in 2010, I thought that I would do a number of videos about my own experience at Glacier View since I was there. I've pretty much come to terms with Glacier View, though you might not think so because here I am speaking about it. But I realise that every person lives in their own little world and experiences the same events differently. I'm very interested in history. I've studied it at university, at tertiary level, and I realise how important it is to leave a record and how important documents and diaries are. If you don't record what happened, in one sense, it never happened. And I wish now that I'd written an intensive diary at the time of Glacier View, but I didn't. I'm writing for posterity. It's just one viewpoint for which I am entirely responsible. My husband has read this, and some of it I left out because he thought I should. My experience of Glacier View and that of others would be somewhat different, and I emphasise that it's just one view. I'm writing particularly in response to things that Dr. Young says on the 4th Morisset video. There are lots of good things that he says, and I'm only commenting on some of it. The 5th video of Des was put up by Phil Butler on his YouTube page after I wrote the script. And Des covers some of the things that I said. In fact, I was grateful for that because I wasn't always sure that what I said was accurate. Now, being a woman, I can't think in a straight line, and so there's some wondering as I describe the background and what I saw as key issues. Just think of Ezekiel 1 and the wheels that went round and round and it turned in many directions. So what I'm doing is a micro-history, the sort of thing a woman would write, not a man. In the end, I'll state where I see things differently to Norman, who was also at Glacier View, where I think the other participants of the Morisset meetings were not. He was there, he participated there in some sense more than I did because he was on the committees. He has a highly competent view of what happened there. It's some details where I would disagree, and it comes from a difference in experience. I'm doing this from memory, and memory, especially after nearly 40 years, is often faulty because the mind embellishes events with later thoughts. So this is a biased view, but I was a witness to some things that others were not. For instance, the Friday afternoon meeting with Prexad and members of the Australasian Division. In my memory, Elder Pastor Keith Parmenter and Arthur Duffy, now both deceased, were present representing the SPD. I did write a list of who was there after the meetings. I did a drawing of where each person was sitting, and Des and I both made notes immediately after the meeting, and all of this I gave to Milton Hook when he was doing his biography, and he put all that information, with much else, in Avondale archives. So I don't have this information to hand. The outcome of Glacier View was no surprise to us. It was a result of Des's emphatic preaching on the issue of righteousness by faith for over a decade, a view that countered the traditional view of the sinful nature of Christ and perfectionism, and the later debate on the book of Hebrews, a challenge to 1844 and the doctrine of the investigative judgment. Glacier View largely resulted because of Des's response to the teachings of Robert Brinsmead about 1844.
Okay, so I'll put a link to this video in the video description. So I'm going to close things out with a hymn, which I think my dad would have liked.
The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by. My soul he doth restore again, and me to walk doth make within the paths of righteousness, within the paths of righteousness, yea, for his own name's sake. Yea, though I walk in death's dark vale, yet will I fear not ill, for thou art with me, and thy rod, for thou art with me, and thy rod and staff me comfort still. My table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes. My head thou dost with oil anoint. My head thou dost with oil anoint, and my cup overflows. Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me, and in God's house forevermore, and in God's house forevermore, my dwelling place shall be.
Thanks for watching. Take care.